Hi, everyone. Welcome. Come on in. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. But welcome to our Education Roundtable with Girls Leadership on our Ready to Lead report. Come on in. All right. Thank you all so much for coming out and taking the time to engage in this important conversation today. My name is Simone Marian. I'm the co-CEO and the co-founder of Girls Leadership. And Girls Leadership, we're a national educational nonprofit, and our mission is to teach girls to exercise the power of their voice. We are based in Oakland, California, and we run our programs nationally. We provide programs for girls, workshops for families, and professional development training for teachers, guidance counselors, and nonprofit staff. Our work at Girls Leadership centers gender and racial equity to address the internal and external barriers to girls' leadership development. Today's roundtable is the fourth in a series to understand the implications of our Ready to Lead research report that came out last August. Today, we're here to discuss the implications in education and to look at how schools can better support the leadership of Black and Latinx girls. The final roundtable will be in June on the 24th to look at implications in policy. We hope that you'll join us for that conversation as well. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the sponsor of today's event, which is Vodafone America's Foundation. So thank you to Vodafone. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the land. While we're gathered from all over the country, Girls Leadership is based in Oakland, California, which is the land of the Ohlone people. We remember their connection to this land and give thanks to the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to the elders and to all Ohlone people, past and present. We invite you all to also honor the land of the people where you are today. Thank you. We invite you to share today's conversation on social. Our handle is @GirlsLeadership, and this research thread is #ReadyToLead. It is my pleasure to introduce the Ready to Lead author, Dr. Charlotte Jacobs, and an incredible leader in this space, so I'm honored to have with us here today. Dr. Charlotte Jacobs is an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. Her research interests focus on issues of identity development, race, and gender in education concerning adolescent girls of color, teacher education and equity, and youth participation action research, which led her to recently co-found the Engendered Research Collaborative. Charlotte is the co-director of the Independent School Teaching Residency Program at Penn GSE, additionally blending her work with independent schools and YPAR. Charlotte is the research director of the School of Participatory Action Research Collaborative at the Center for the Study of Boys and Girls Lives. Charlotte proudly serves as a board member for the Girls Justice League, the Christina Sykes Academy, and the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charlotte Jacobs.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for that warm welcome. And I'm always excited to be able to come into a space where we can talk about how to serve young people, particularly girls of color. And I'm very excited to have this opportunity to serve as the moderator of this wonderful panel of educators and practitioners, and where we will focus our conversation mostly on the takeaways from the report and the implications of the findings from the Ready to Lead report. So before we jump into the conversation, I'd like to introduce the panelists and give a brief overview of the report findings. Our first panelist is Ileana Jimenez. Ileana is the creator of Feminist Teacher, so feministteacher.com and @feministteacher on Instagram and Twitter, and the hashtags HSFeminism and K12 feminism. A teacher activist for 25 years, she teaches Black and Latina feminisms, pedagogies, and curricula to high school students, teachers, and graduate students. Her doctoral research in English education at Teachers College, Columbia University, focuses on critical feminist pedagogies in schools and feminist digital and school-based activisms. In 2011, Jimenez received a distinguished Fulbright to work with queer youth in Mexico City. Globally, she is presented in Argentina, Australia, Greece, India, Mexico, and the UK. Jimenez has published in Youth Sexualities, Public Feelings and Contemporary Cultural Politics, Meridians, Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism, Radical Teacher, and One Teacher in 10 in the New Millennium, LGBT Educators Speak Out. She received her BA in English Literature at Smith College and an MA in English Literature at Middlebury College. Welcome, Ileana. We're glad to have you here. Next slide. Our second panelist is Dr. Nadia Lopez. Dr. Lopez is pioneering a path of inspired leadership to show the world how underprivileged communities can beat the odds and create positive institutions that have a global impact. As the founder of Mott Hall Bridges Academy, a New York City public school located in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Lopez's story became a viral sensation as millions of people around the world became inspired by the positive learning environment, high expectations, and growing success rate at a school right in the middle of one of the most underserved communities in America. She is the best-selling author of The Bridge to Brilliance, an international speaker, and an award-winning educator who was honored alongside First Lady Michelle Obama with the Black Girls Rock Change Agent Award. She delivered a TED Talk on why she opened a school to close a prison, and is currently the Chief Visionary Officer of the Lopez Effect, where she provides strategic planning and coaching to leaders and educators, as well as the co-founder of Elevated, BLK, which focuses on sustainability, personal development, and wellness. Welcome, Dr. Lopez. And our third panelist is Neferrifi Ife Bell. Ife Bell proudly wears the title of a daughter, sister, mother, aunt, and a fifth-generation entrepreneur. Her life is dedicated to expanding others' capacity to bring their best self to every aspect of their life. She is a thought leader and coach with over 15 years of experience working with organizations, communities, education, and nonprofits to increase business performance and develop strategies that focus on diversity, equity, and belonging. Ife is an organizational thought leader who can create effective strategies to increase outcomes in multiple industries. Her career track shows measurable success in working with organizations and C-level leaders to increase business performance, develop strategies that focus on leadership, and foster collaborative relationships. She is strategic in creating and delivering training across all levels of an organization. She has achieved multiple accomplishments in roles such as Chief Strategy Officer, Director of Possibilities, Community Partnership Manager, and District Community Coordinator, along with other successful business roles as consultant and founder. Ife's academic credentials include a master's degree in executive leadership and organizational change, as well as a certified facilitator and John Maxwell coach. Her passion for providing guidance and effective solutions has driven her to pursue a doctorate in organizational development and change from Bowling Green State University. Woo, shout out Ohio, I'm from Cleveland, and is expected to graduate in 2023. Welcome, Ife. So now that we have introduced our panelists, you can clearly see that this is going to be a fruitful and generative discussion as our panelists bring such a variety of expertise and experiences to the table. And before we begin, I'm going to spend a few minutes just giving an overview of the Ready to Lead research study and findings so that we're all starting from a similar place of understanding. So we can go to the next slide. So first, the study methodology. So the slide there gives you an idea of where the participants for the study were coming from and also who they were. This research study focused on the personal, societal, and structural factors that deeply impact Black and Latinx girls' leadership, identity, aspiration, and skill development. The study included 2012 girls, parent and guardian interviews, and 601 teacher surveys to learn the systems of support that girls of color identify for their leadership development, and also what barriers to leadership, both internal and external, exist for girls of color. The study was conducted in Los Angeles, California, New York, and Cincinnati, Ohio. Next slide. So one of the major findings that we detail in the report, and this is also where we actually developed the title for the report, is that Black and Latinx girls are ready to lead. And you can see on the slide there that our study found that Black and Latinx girls, more than other girls of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, identify as leaders and have leadership aspirations. Black girls are the most likely to identify as leaders compared to girls of other races. And overall, girls of color were more likely to report that they seek out leadership opportunities compared to white girls. Black and Latinx girls also identified several different factors contributing to their interest in leadership and leading, and they were more likely than girls of other races to consider leadership skills as critical for meeting their goals in life. And you can find out more about the different aspects of their leadership identities in the report. Next slide. So another finding was looking at leadership skills, and the graphic on the screen here shows how Black and Latinx girls also scored significantly higher than white, Asian, or multi-ethnic girls on the Rowitz rating scale for leadership. What was interesting about this finding was that not only Black and Latinx girls scored highly in leadership skills, but for me, when I was talking with them, also how they defined leadership and leadership skills. And so I want to read a quote from the report from a high school Black girl, where I asked her, how are you defining leadership? And here is the definition that she gave. She said, leadership is about having a common vision and having the character and humility to guide, collaborate, and learn from your team, group, or organization. Leadership is about knowing the members of your team, group, and organization well enough to encourage and challenge them to grow into leaders themselves. Leadership is caring about the people you are leading and doing what you can to support them and represent them as genuinely as you can. And I always love having that quotation as a part of sharing the findings of this report, because I really do think that it just elevates how girls of color in particular are seeing their role as leaders within their communities and within their schools, and the skills that they appreciate having going into leadership positions. All right, next slide. So another finding was also looking at the supports that Black and Latinx girls had, and one of the findings was it was very important that adult mentors and role models played a role in supporting the leadership of Black and Latinx girls. So our study found that girls whose parents think of them as a leader are more likely to score higher on the leadership scale. And relatedly, Black and Latinx girls named their mothers as the biggest sources of support for their leadership aspirations. Additionally, the presence of a mentor in girls' lives was positively correlated with higher scores on the leadership scale, as well as earning higher grades. Almost half of the girls in the study significantly reported having an adult mentor in their lives. Next slide. So building on the previous finding about the importance of adult mentors and role models, we specifically looked at teachers and how they influence the leadership of Black and Latinx girls. And so on the screen here, you'll see we had a finding that we found that teacher race matters. Black and Latinx girls are more likely to score high on the leadership scale, especially if their schools have more teachers of color. What's interesting about this is that across the board, Black and Latinx girls score higher on the leadership scale than girls of other ethnicities, even if they're in schools with predominantly white teachers. But if they're in schools with predominantly teachers of color, they score even higher on the leadership scale. Next slide. And then our final finding also looked at teacher bias. So we found that teacher bias, particularly deficit thinking when it comes to the leadership abilities and skills of Black and Latinx girls, serves as a barrier to their leadership. In our study, over 1 in 3 Black and Latinx girls who scored high on the leadership scale reported witnessing racial bias, and nearly 1 in 2 Black girls said that they have experienced unfair treatment because of their race from teachers and administrators. Additionally, over 1 in 3 Black teachers in our study noted that at their schools, students of color experience bias and unfair treatment in the form of not having the same opportunity to get leadership roles, teachers having lower expectations for students of color compared to white students, and students of color experiencing harsher disciplinary actions than white students who exhibit the same behaviors. So now that we are all caught up on the research highlights, I'm going to move so that we can hear from our panelists about what they're taking away from the research and their thoughts about action and impact moving forward. And so just so that the audience knows, we've arranged so that we're going to have the panelists each take a turn in answering some of the questions. And then after about half an hour of having the panelists share their thoughts and reflections, then we will open it up for questions in the Q&A. So if you do have a question as you hear the panelists sharing their thoughts, please feel free to put that in the Q&A in the Zoom. So my first question for the panelists is just basically, what is your reaction to the report findings? Thinking about your own experiences as educators and practitioners and working with girls and in leadership development, you know, how do the findings resonate or cause you to raise questions about your work? And we'll start with Dr. Lopez.
So, you know, Charlotte, when you said, I'm going to start just kind of even just reflecting on the quote. And I'm paraphrasing what the young person said, that leadership is about caring for one another and uplifting others and creating a space that's intentional about doing that type of work where you're seen and you're heard and you're empowered. And as I thought about the findings, I read through the report over the past couple of days. And I know that the work that I did at Mount Hope Bridges Academy was intentional about one, showing up as a leader in every way, shape, or form. That meant being an example to my staff about the language that they use with the scholars, about the way that they created opportunities, the way in which I intentionally hired people who looked like the children so that they could see reflections of themselves. So whether it was Black or Latinx men, women, or those who identify otherwise, they were present in the school. We had a lot of programming that allowed the scholars to either self-select or force them to be in leadership positions. But one of the findings that was within, that I read that was concerning is that I believe it was 1 in 3 Latinx individuals felt embarrassed, like if they were chosen for a leadership position, and 1 in 4 Black young girls felt embarrassed as well. And so it goes back to that quote again. What is the tone that's being set in that school, in those schools? What is the expectation and the culture that's being cultivated that says, here we create safe spaces. Here we encourage our young people to take risk and to lead and to make change. Here we actually have conversations with those who ridicule others, because then that is an issue about their own personal self-esteem and what they're actually projecting onto others. And so my questions was more about, what are the leaders in those buildings doing to actually ensure that there are safe spaces? And how are they holding the teachers accountable and having conversations, or even providing the professional development to do so? Because I think that sometimes we just assume because people are in a position of teaching that they also have the capacity of actually being compassionate, empathetic, and knowing how to cultivate leaders in our own buildings.
Great, thank you so much. And there's so many follow-up questions that I have, but I will turn it over to Ify. And Ify, feel free to respond to anything that that Nadia said, or your own takeaways.
Yeah, so many things were running through my mind, both in listening to Nadia and listening to you share again, Charlotte, about the report, and from reading the report, and just reflecting on so many different things. But I think something that struck me, definitely in that definition again, in the report, was that leadership is about caring about the people you lead, but it was also about representing and supporting them. And the word represent and support really stuck out to me in thinking about the work of systems change. And so Nadia talked about the work in the classroom and in as the administrator. My role in previous times in the district was more around that systems level work, around the process and the procedure. And so, the things that I began to think about when reading this were, how do we think about how we're doing things in the treasurer's office? How are we thinking about how we're actually doing things in the HR department? And how are we thinking about the facilities maintenance, right? So those things create barriers that we don't think about to even be able to implement and execute some of these opportunities and really create that change. So, we have to have conversations, uncommon conversations, ones that we're not typically having. And so most people don't think about girls leadership and then connect it to the treasurer's office, right? But how do we move a purchase order through? If it's really a priority, the data is telling us it's a priority, right? They're ready and we need to take action. And so what do we put in place to just process a requisition that much faster? I don't know if y'all have had to process a requisition before, but we all know we got some scars from that, right? And so, like, how do we even move that along faster? How do we think about, the ways that, field trips are being processed and approved differently, right? So it's those small things within the system that support our ability. And so when I thought about the word support, being an African American woman, being a Black woman, and really advocating for those systems level changes, to the smallest minute things of just getting YouTube unblocked in a classroom so that we could actually access information in ways differently. And so those were the things that were coming up for me, was just like, where are the low hanging fruit, but sometimes the invisible things that are the Achilles heel that are really holding us back from really seeing that widespread change we need to see.
Great, thanks so much. I also have follow-up questions for you, but I'm going to hold on to them. Ileana, your takeaways or responses to what you've heard so far?
First of all, thank you to Girls Leadership and to you, Charlotte. It's so great to be here with all of you. I feel like it's a little bit of a mini reunion and a new meeting with Ify. So I'm wondering if we could maybe go back to that slide you showed with the kind of low rates of it was one with bar graphs, where this one, yes, percentage of girls scoring high on leadership scale by teachers' race. I thought this was really interesting. I have been teaching in schools for nearly 25 years, and I have to say, in predominantly white schools where Black and Latinx girls really are looking for that mirroring of teachers of color, and in particular, women of color, Black and Latinx faculty who will reflect back to them the kind of leadership that they can actually aspire to. And for me, I'm really glad that you framed this, Charlotte, by saying, how do you define leadership? Because often we can get trapped in thinking about leadership only in kind of wealth-oriented terms, or aspirational only in terms of acquiring wealth, or only in terms of acquiring certain forms of power that can actually be damaging or harmful. So I'm really glad that you framed it as that the girls were engaging in their own definitions of leadership. And so what are the ways in which we can dismantle our assumptions about what Black and Latinx girls are thinking about their own definitions of leadership, and that it's quite different from master narrative assumptions of, and racist, sexist notions of leadership that get into the public. And then this slide really struck me in the sense of how, what are the ways in which Black and Latinx girls are really responding to the presence of teachers of color. And what I wanted to know more about is the story underneath these bar graphs. What kind of work are these particular teachers of color doing with Black and Latinx girls where these bar graphs would be so high? So it's not just that they're there in the building, it's that they're doing something with the students that makes a difference. And for me, that work is always about critical consciousness. It's about doing inner work on self-actualization. It's about engaging in conversations around anti-racism, racial identity development, gender identity. So that and how gender identity intersects with race and class and ethnicity, so and sexuality as well. So what's the work for me is the question that is underneath these bar graphs.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I agree with you that, when we have research reports like this, it always leads to more questions. You have this initial finding and then it makes us think, well, what are the other things that we want to know about or see that different people are experiencing that can explain why we see the data that we see. So thank you for pointing that out, Liliana. And both you and Nadia both raised the importance of teachers and thinking about teachers of color as being significant in terms of impacting Black and Latinx girls and their leadership aspirations and how they see themselves as leaders. And I'm wondering if either one of you can talk more about, so what do you think teachers need to know? What are some of the things that would be helpful for teachers to be educated in around supporting Black and Latinx girls in their leadership? Interestingly, although I didn't share this in the major findings of the report, one of the findings that we found is that 30% of teachers talked about how they have not received professional development in either gender equity or leadership development. So there seems to be a hole there in terms of skill building or even awareness about how to support Black and Latinx girls in their leadership.
I think, well, it's not so much I think, what I know is important is to say that teachers need to know that young people aren't monolithic, especially young people of color. That the stereotypes that they walk in with, which is part of their own personal biases, should not exist in a classroom. And most importantly, that they're human beings. They forget that children are human beings. I personally had to deal with people know how to come in with the imposter, right? They come in with the mask on to get the job. And then when they actually have the position, there are things that are said that they don't recognize is part of the low expectation, is part of the racial biases, right? So case in point, I had an art teacher who was talking to the scholars about creating 3-dimensional figures. They was working on the art project. And she referenced a building that's downtown Brooklyn, the Torrin, and said to them, there's this amazing architectural building downtown Brooklyn. And she pulls up pictures of it. And then she said something to the effect of, not like you'll ever be able to go into a building like that, but, the mere fact that it's here in Brooklyn. And I happened to be in the classroom. And I lost it, right? Like I lost it because, the kids didn't even assess like this is wrong, but I had to, in the middle of class, like normally it's like, get up, pull the teacher out. I was like, no, I said, I'm sorry, let's just go back to that comment. So first off, it's in Brooklyn and all of you are from Brooklyn. You could definitely live there. Second off, my cousin has 2 condos in there. She's Black, just like all of us in here. She was born and raised in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. She wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth, but I tell you this, worked really hard. And she had family like me who's going to stand up just like I love all of you and tell you can go anywhere you want to, right? And in that moment, it was just the mother in me, the Black Latina in me, the Brooklynite in me just wouldn't allow that to happen, because that was already going to plant a seed that if they saw that building, they would say, I will never be able to go in there, right? And so it's moments like that where if I hadn't been in that classroom, I don't know how many times that teacher would have said something like that to the children. So it's important that teachers understand that every time you're speaking, your words have value and power. Every time you start to speak to them from a deficit mindset of you're saying what they're not going to be capable of doing, as opposed to, but the idea is that we're going to build these structures because one day you can build a building like this. One day you can live in a building like this because they're exactly in your neighborhoods. It's the way you expect of them, right? Because I know if we were in Stuyvesant High School, she wouldn't have said anything like that to any of those children. Right. And so afterwards, I had to have a conversation with the teacher because I also didn't want her thinking that, you know, some people will get emotional and think that I'm going to target them. I said, consider what damage you could have done to those children. Has anyone in your lifetime ever told you where you couldn't go? And I gave her a minute to think about it and she couldn't answer. I said, so we don't want to do that to those children. And I don't want to just put it out on one particular race of teachers. I think that it's also because of class. And when we think about the neighborhoods, even sometimes teachers who look like us, individuals of color, because of systemic oppression, will just automatically say the same things as well because of the low expectations that we've seen. And we've also taken in ourselves and start speaking the same language. So it's just important. I always draw on, as a leader, you're supposed to hold the highest expectations of your staff, but also develop them professionally, which is something that you said a lot of them say they don't get. That's the first thing that needs to happen before they even step foot into a classroom.
Great, thank you. And that was so powerful. And it also makes me think of, Ileana, what you're doing in your classroom as an educator in terms of nurturing the critical consciousness of your students and helping them to take on the role of both leaders and also change agents and activists. And it sounds like what Nadia did as an intervention in that space was developing that critical consciousness, you know, for those students. And so I wonder, Ileana, if you can talk more about what would it look like for teachers to be able to do that, and how can teachers develop that critical consciousness and help students to see themselves as activists and as leaders?
I love this question, and I love, Nadia, the example that you gave. I think often what's forgotten is that there's this assumption that teachers walk into classrooms as fully realized humans, fully realized adults, when in actuality, that's very far from the truth, because there are so few opportunities, first of all, in anybody's trajectory to do that self-inner work on racial identity, gender identity, sexual identity, whiteness. I think I saw something in the chat about, you know, working with white teachers. That we forget that teachers are also need a space to do the inner work of critical consciousness themselves so that they don't cause harm to their students, particularly students of color. And I think, as Nadia said earlier, building on this notion of not every teacher of color necessarily has critical consciousness, because we ourselves have internalized so many gradations of racism, so many gradations of and you know, for sexism, homophobia, etc., racist sexism, that we have to do that dismantling work for ourselves as we work with our students. So that's one portion of the work. If we don't do that work with teachers, what's going to happen is that these colonized minds are going to continue to perpetuate curricula and pedagogical practices that just perpetuate a white master narrative of patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, all kinds of institutionalized racism, everything from microaggressions to racial violence in schools. So perpetuated by adults, I'm talking about. So how do we begin to do this work at the kind of classroom level, curricular level, and you know, it's funny, like the words like professional development, trainings, workshops, like these are all the kind of lingo of what now is called like diversity, equity, inclusion, and DEI work, which has become so corporatized and has nothing to do with real shifting of change and real shifting of consciousness. It's just like a checkbox. And so I really bristle against these DEI efforts being done by schools in order to just do that checkbox work. Instead, classroom work, curricular work, internal work with teachers and with students, institutional work for transformative change is really what needs to be the focus. And that really takes time. And it takes, it's literally looking at trauma and the trauma of students, trauma of also teacher trauma. So there are just various levels to this that I think there's an assumption that teachers with the best intentions are going to churn out to do work that is good, when in actuality, so much harm is done without this kind of foundational critical consciousness inner work.
Great, thank you. And I think you raised such an important point around, so both you and Nadia were talking about kind of the interpersonal, so teachers working with students, but also the internal, teachers needing to work on themselves. And I actually want to move over to Ify because you talked about systems and how also, and Ileana, the ending of your comment kind of ended in that place too, around the importance of institutional change and systems change. And so while we're doing this work on the interpersonal level and the internal level, there also needs to be change at the systems level in order to support girls of color in their leadership. So Ify, what are some recommendations that you have for the way that schools can, or organizations that work with young people, particularly girls of color, that they can shift or need to transform to support girls of color in their leadership?
Oh, that's such a good question, and so many things that were just said that I'm like, ooh, what time is the party afterwards? Because I have so many things to ask, right? But I want to say, a couple things are coming up for me. One is, one of my favorite quotes is, "The fear of change is greater than the insanity we live in." And we have all been bathed in the US, at least, right? I'm going to speak from where my feet find me. In the isms, we've been bathed in them, right? And it's really time to get out of the water and start drying off. And so when we think about, right, what do we do next? Leadership, when I think about teachers, so I want to clarify, in the work that I did with girls leadership and leading a district-wide initiative for girls leadership, it is not oftentimes are they always teachers, but I want to just call into the room the rest of the educators in the space. When we think about who students are identifying, they're identifying secretaries, nurses, after school staff, lunchroom workers, security staff, paraprofessionals, and they are that village really that we need to think about. And so we put a lot of effort towards educating and transforming principals and teachers, and we forget to invest in the full ecosystem of education, right? From the bus driver to the crossing guards to the cafeteria staff or food. I know they have a whole nother title now. So that work in the cafeteria, right? We really have to think about that systems level of investment, right? And we have to do, and I think one other step in that system is to go back to higher ed where they're being trained. So if we don't shift at the higher ed space where we're teaching and training teachers and educators and developing them, we're just going to keep, the machine is just going to keep churning out the same thing, right? Because that fear of change, the system, it wants to resist innovation. It wants to resist divergent thinking, and it wants to get back to what it's supposed to produce. And anything divergent from it is trying to crush it and get back to the widget it's supposed to put out. And so does that mean then that teachers, a whole year of what? Now, I'm not an educator. I have a background in bachelor's in business administration. I'm just going to say this in full disclosure. Didn't go through what you teachers went through to be educated. But how about we strip out a year and just make this a year's worth of curriculum for teachers? Right? And then where are the unions, right? We have so many teachers unions. I saw it, Nadia. Ohio has one of the strongest collection of teachers unions in the country, right? So, but teachers unions contracts, I say this out of love, they're really built on a whole lot of things that didn't feel good. So we just keep layering them in there instead of addressing them. So, when we think about this future forward thinking of systems change, we've got to think differently about how we're educating and training teachers, how we're educating and training principals and superintendents, as well as the rest of the staff, how we're investing those dollars. If we know that DE&I right now in the schools, if we just take the checkbox approach, then we're going to probably allocate like we do for family engagement. We're going to put like 10% of our budget towards it, which means it's really not important, right? If it's really important, number one, it's in a budget, and it's not in a grant. It's not in a donation budget. It's not in some other thing. It is in the general fund budget, and we are committed to spend the money towards it, and it's reflected in that, right? And then we have to make sure that as we're requiring this work of our teachers and of our principals, that all administration is committed to do that work, right? From the secretary that handles the COBRA payments to everybody, right? Everybody, right? The security guard at the front desk, our bus drivers, and that's going to take a significant amount of investment, and we're going to have to go slow in order to go fast. But it is a sense of urgency. And I also thought about, reflecting back on the leadership that they want to aspire to be. I would say to my superintendent at the time when I was working on developing this, and I would say, I just want to tell you a secret. If we don't do something about the teachers and the principals not living up to this thing we're trying to teach the kids about leadership, it's not going to work. So what we gonna do about that, right? Because if principals and teachers are like excited to have these programs, but then they turn around and act like the kids can't see it, and they go and then they do these horrific things to each other, still this challenging behavior that that doesn't describe what we just heard as leadership, right? We're supporting and representing each other. It's that double speak, it's that hypocrisy, and students can see through all that Maybelline. And so we have to do something different, right? And so it's got to be a systems, individual, organizational, and whole ecosystem adjustment. And that means that leadership becomes a lifestyle, not something I just live at work, or I just live in my community, or I just live this different version in my family. But my lifestyle of leadership is fostering belonging in all three of those ecosystems.
That is beautiful. I'm so happy this is being recorded because I feel like I need to go back to that and think about this idea of ecosystems of belonging, right? And how the different people who make up that ecosystem contribute to supporting the leadership for girls of color. So we have time for one more question before we open it up to the Q&A. And, one of the reasons that we brought all of you here for the panel is because we know that you have experience working in organizational spaces and also in educational institutions to support girls of color in their leadership. And we're hoping to draw on your expertise of what you see that's working. So what are some of the things, if we think about what Ify was just saying around developing this culture of belonging, an ecosystem of belonging, what are some things that you see within your own space that educators or practitioners are doing that are moving towards cultivating that ecosystem of belonging? And Nadia, I'll start with you.
Well, first, let me go back to Ife. Like that, all of that, right? It was so on point, and I think that it's really important that there always has to be that conversation of everyone encompassed in it, because our children are impacted by every single adult that they come in contact with. And that's the reality. And so there has to be a standard that's set that says everyone here is here for the purpose of ensuring that our children become great and that our girls know that they are unstoppable. So let me just first put that out there. That's such a hard question that you asked. And I think that it's hard because of, honestly, what we've experienced with COVID. And I just have to be 100% in saying there has been conversations that started. It's forced people to reallocate money and do all the things. But to what avail? Because there isn't a conversation about how can we make this long-term and sustainable. Things are happening for the fanfare. Things are happening because of press conferences, but it's not happening because we really want to change the system. It's not happening because we want to, start anew and really erect new policies and really create spaces that we know are possible. There are too many individuals who are hell-bent in keeping us in our places, right? So yes, we can hire more leaders. And even, I'm going to say from New York City, we can hire a chancellor who reflects, being a Black woman. But if the people underneath her are the same folks who have been responsible for the way our schools function, for the policies, for the compliance, for the lack of support. When Ife talked about getting a requisition, process, like I have kids I need to deal with and trauma I need to deal with. And here you are talking about, instead of just moving the money like I asked, let me help you do the, moving of the money. I don't need you to tell me, I don't need that. Just move the money, right? So it's things like that exist that we still haven't tackled. We still haven't been intentional about changing the curriculum, right? One thing that I know, Ileana and I worked on the Young Women's Initiative, right? And that was an amazing process to do that work. And we talked about just even the text that our young people read. What's the type of text that our young people read? Teachers don't even have the autonomy of selecting text that's reflective of cultures that our children relate to, that talk about the different types of the heroism not being a white woman, like all of the things that we need to change in terms of creating a different narrative that doesn't say, well, if it's not someone who's white, not someone who's cis, that it doesn't matter. Everyone else's narrative doesn't apply to what we should be learning and teaching our children. I would just wish people had more audacity. I would wish that this report that you created, that I'm sure we could have found 10 years ago, but the fact that young people are still saying the same things, I need folks to take this serious. I need superintendents to take this serious. I need policymakers to sit at the table with superintendents, with principals, with teachers and parents and children all at the same time to talk about what does this say and what do we need to do to create changes and who do we hold accountable? Because it's all of us at this table, but at what level? So the conversations are happening. We have DEI offices that are happening. People are getting placed. There's new faces, but we're still doing the same things behind closed doors. And so there needs to be more audacity, more intentionality, and folks need to look at this report as a foundation to say, we can't do this another 10 years, folks, another 20 years. Now is the time. Our girls say they are ready. Let's get to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yes, Ileana, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nadia and Ife, and both of your answers. I want to circle back to Ife's point about teacher education and Nadia's point about curriculum. I am so incredibly committed to the work of curriculum in schools. Like I feel like, especially for critical feminist pedagogy, from a women of color perspective, is my absolute commitment. So when I heard you earlier, Ife, say that we need to work on teacher ed, I could not agree more. The majority of teachers in schools are white women.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to put that in one bucket here. The other side of this is that there's not enough teacher ed that includes, from my perspective, Black and Latinx, women of color feminisms as a part of the work of teacher education. So if you've got majority white women learning to, or supposedly learning to go into schools, and there's not enough intersectional work being done, and not enough Black and Latina and particularly Black feminisms being centered as a part of the way that we engage with teacher ed, then we're not doing the work of dismantling systems of oppression. We're not doing the work of doing exactly what Black feminists have been saying forever, which is we have to do the work. I think of Bell Hooks, for example, says we have to do the work of self-actualization, critical consciousness, decolonization, looking at how racial capitalism infects every part of schooling and infects every part of teacher education. So what are teacher education programs trying to really, so I'm using the word produce and reproduce. And what gets reproduced? Whiteness, white master narratives through white women. So as Nadia said earlier, how do we begin to shift the curriculum? For myself, to your question earlier, Charlotte, I directly teach high school students Black and Latina feminisms. So they're reading, just in the fall of this pandemic, we read Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. We read How We Get Free, which includes the Combahee River Collective's Black Feminist Statement. We read Charlene Carruthers' new memoir, Unapologetic, which focuses on Black feminist queer mandates for change and activism. And the Black feminism, Black and Latina feminisms have always been a part of this course. And during pandemic, what I noticed is that the students had even more of a sense of urgency and commitment to these texts because they felt it all around them. They wanted to do the work even more so. And what they noticed was, are our teachers doing this same work as we are? Are they doing this hard work of looking at these kinds of texts as we are? Are they, because it's not just going to the DEI workshop, it's also, are you actually really building a sense of commitment to anti-racist work that is not only relational, but systemic, as we've been saying?
Thank you. Wonderful.
Charlotte, is it okay if I jump in? I know we were at that last question. I'm over here in my seat trying to hold on, right?
Yes, go for it.
So I want to say a couple things just about what's happening. There are pockets happening, right? And so when we're in this work and doing girls leadership, 10 years ago, I said to myself, how many people do I have to impact to feel like I'm having an impact? Because it felt like a tidal wave, like, oh my goodness, right? Like, and that'll just make you just sit down and say, I'm gonna just sit here, right? And so for me, I decided it was one, and everything above the one was a bonus, right? So there are pockets happening of work, amazing work that people are doing with young women and with Black and Latinx girls and with white girls all across the country. And so I want to acknowledge them, but we're still at the yet. We haven't moved to saturation levels that Ileana and Nadia are also calling out. And I want to also say, like, to Nadia, she said, we need to take superintendents and boards in this collective table. So first I say, throw the table out the room. That's just another power structure. Let's just get in a circle, because then we can expand and contract as necessary. But we don't need to gather another data point. Don't run another report. Don't collect another survey. You got all you need already to take action. Quite literally, you could go back to the things you promised that you never got to, that are on number 5 and 6, and start there. So there's no need. So don't get data analysis paralysis. I just want to say to boards and superintendents and principals and teachers, everybody in the room, you don't need another survey. Don't do it, right? But then I just want to take a moment, and as an African-American woman, and speak to other women of color and say, we have our own work to do. We have things we have to, Nadia spoke to it before about, not everyone is in the same place. And so we have work to do, right? We have to make sure that we're also committing to this same level of work that we're asking our peers of white women to do. because there's not a litmus test to see if everybody is, in the right space. So to just assume that, oh, I'll hire more African Americans, and Nadia said, we'll put a Black woman in the superintendent's office. That doesn't mean she has a clue and that she's actually going to do what is really necessary to do. She may do more harm than what we need done. So we really need to think about, are we doing our own work as well? And not waiting on someone to invite us to start doing our own work. Just it's time, right? It's time to get out of the water and dry off, right? And so I just wanted to throw that in there and say, last but not least, when Black women win, everybody wins. When Black and Latinx girls win, everybody will win. And that's just Efi's professional, statement about it, but I'll tell you what I know.
Thank you. And that's a great point to end on. I'm going to turn it over to Simone. I think we have time for maybe one question from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for this conversation today. It is so powerful. I can't take notes fast. And I'm at the end of my notebook and I'm like writing on the cardboard side because I'm trying to capture every word. So I can't wait to go back and rewatch this. Thank you for your perspective. The first question is from a parent. And if you could help this parent understand, as parents with the parent relationship to a school, how do you address what's happening with white teachers? And it says in the question, very emotional, period. So holding that emotional impact of white teachers, what do you advise parents to do?
Always tell parents to show up. And I want to be clear on what it means to show up. So you allow the school to have your gift in its presence. All the individuals that are in the school, your gift are your children. And so you allow us to have them in our presence. So my mom isn't from this country. She's from Guatemala, and she didn't have the education to go toe to toe with teachers. She went up to 6th grade. But what she knew was, I'm her baby. And all of my teachers in elementary school were white. She wanted to make sure that they knew she had a mother. And when she didn't understand something, she went to the principal because she said, oh, okay, I remember I came home and we had a test on compasses and I failed. And that just does not happen in my house, right? So I explained to my mother, she didn't teach us. She taught us one day and she didn't go over anything. She didn't give us homework. My mother was like, oh no, she went straight. She took off. She never takes off. She took off. She went to the principal and she said, I need her to explain to me why my daughter failed. And I need you to call her down here. And the principal asked the teacher and she said, oh, I just wanted to see where they were at. And my mother said, I don't need you to see where she's at because she's going to think she failed. I need you to make sure that she knows so that she can get a good grade, because that's what I want in my house, right? And so I say that because, one, you need to know that there are advocates in the building. Like everybody has a boss. So for a teacher, you need to know that if you don't feel comfortable speaking to the teacher, speak to the guidance counselor, speak to the parent advocate who's in the building, speak to the assistant principal, speak to the principal. The second thing I would say is don't go in there alone if you will feel uncomfortable. Find an advocate for you. Just as you're supposed to advocate for your child, find someone who you feel comfortable sharing the situation with and who will go into the school or send the email on your behalf so that this way you don't feel the interference, because sometimes parents are overwhelmed. I don't want to say something because they think that there is going to be repercussions that happens with their children. The third thing is the superintendent is supposed to ensure that parents' voices are heard. So you have superintendent and you also have elected officials. But it's important that you know as a parent, you have the power. Even though many schools will make it seem like you don't, you always have the power. So those are the three things that I would share with a parent in addressing, especially when it comes to white teachers. If you feel, because there's a dynamic and that there's racial tension, right? Because you don't know, are you being passive aggressive? Is this microaggression? What is this? always make sure that's why you have somebody else there, so that they're very clear and witness what happens. And they also know someone's watching you. You've been put on notice.
I think the thing I would add to that is, from a teacher perspective, is what work are white teachers doing to examine whiteness? And what work are they doing to examine whiteness alongside their gender identity? So one thing I notice about schools is that they'll, especially independent schools, and I'm sure various kinds of schools do this work of dividing faculty into white affinity groups and then teacher of color affinity groups. And I think the thing, and I don't know, I haven't been myself in white affinity groups, but I think the thing, because I don't identify with those particular groups, but I think what's needed is not just for white people to talk about whiteness, but for white men to sit together and talk about what does it mean to be cis white men in schools, perpetuating certain forms of misogyny and sexism through curriculum, through relationships with students, with their colleagues, through power dynamics if they're administrators, and for white women to also examine, how am I perpetuating patriarchy? How am I perpetuating racism against girls of color? Racist sexism against girls of color, against students of color in general. So that kind of work at the real level of detail of how are white teachers really examining gender and race alongside each other, because I don't think it's being done to a level of depth that it really deserves.
Thank you, Ileana. I think you ended on a perfect note in terms of calling us forward to look at that intersection. Oh, Takai, are you there to close?
I am here. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Charlotte, for moderating today's conversation and just for championing the research and for the work that you do. I want to also just thank our panelists so much again, also for just this rich conversation, for sharing your wisdom and your expertise, and then providing us with some strategies to move forward as we're all working towards reimagining schools where gender and racial equity can be centered. And I think, as you said, for the benefit of girls of color, but ultimately for the benefit of all students. So I want to thank you so much for that. Again, also want to thank our sponsors. Simone, do you want to share the slides? Our roundtable today is sponsored by Vodafone America's Foundation, as well as our upcoming roundtable on June 24th, where we'll look at the policy implications for this research. I just want to also highlight our upcoming summer programs. We have in-person and online camps for girls in 4th grade through 8th grade, so we can nurture that leadership, the leadership abilities and aspirations of girls. And then just one of the things that was talked about so much in this conversation today about the educators, administrators, those adult influencers working with girls who want to begin the work or continue the work of that critical consciousness development, where we planned a summer to have an in-person retreat, a wellness retreat in collaboration with Sacred Roots, a Women of Color Healing Collective. And then we also have an online professional development training. Our goal being that we're centering wellness for both students and educators to be able to start this next school year in a different kind of way. So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you on June 24th. And in the meantime, everyone, please be well.